الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. We are continuing our lesson of Kitab Al Tawheed, the book of Tawheed, the book of monotheism by Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala. And we will go through a recap of what we've been through. And the Shaykh rahimahullah, he's made this book to separate between those who claim to be the people of the Sunnah, but they go into different shirk, associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and bid'ah innovations that then lead to associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And many of the people, when it comes to the idea of Tawheed and shirk and aqidah, they hear these words and they think, I know it all. Like, and as we see in this book, there is many chapters and many things that are not clear to people, that they do not know about. That many people, they go on in their lives committing minor shirk, in some communities, and some people committing major shirk, and they have no idea that they are doing it. And this is because of the jahl that they have, the ignorance. So subhanallah, Shaykh al-Islam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he formulated this book from ayat and ahadith, verses from the Quran and sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What comes from his own words in this book maybe adds up to a page, even if even not. He has created this book due to being at his time, there was a lot of shirk going about. Graves being worshipped, being built upon, innovations. And he put together this book for it to be a guidance to the people. And he begins this book by showing the obligation of Tawheed. And rather, he does not name the chapter, he enters straight into the ayat. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created jinn and mankind except to worship me. And Tawheed is formulated from three different parts. The first of them being Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Rabi', what's Tawheed al-Rububiyyah?
Affirming that there's only one God and there's no one with him.
MashaAllah. That there's one God. He creates, he destroys, he brings life, he takes it away. That he is the most powerful. He is the all-powerful. And there is no one with him in that. And the second of the parts, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah. This one's for Ismail. Ismail, Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, what is it?
Well, I don't know.
You don't know?
Believing in his oneness and
Believing in his oneness in what? We'll open it up to the people. Put your hand up if you know what Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah is. Rabi' again. Yalla.
Believing that there's only one God and there's no attributes with him.
La.
There's not.
Ismail. Yes. Tawheed al-Ibadah. In worship. That you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. No one else with him. And Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, it links in from Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Because if you believe that there is one God who is the most powerful, and he creates and he destroys, then he is the only one worthy to be worshipped. Because there is no one in that like him. And the third of them is Tawheed al-Asma' wal-Sifat. The oneness of his names and attributes. And this is affirming all his names. That he is the Rahman, the most merciful. The Rahim, the most forgiving. Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum. His attributes, that he comes down in the last third of the night. That he is upon his throne. As he subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa. that the most merciful is established upon his throne. Believing in all this. And the focus of this book is Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, the oneness of worship. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worthy of worship. And if you understand Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah and you believe in it, then Tawhid al-Rububiyyah and Tawhid al-Asma' wal-Sifat, it comes under it anyway. And they all link into each other. They are not three separate parts, but they all make up one. And then after showing the obligation of Tawheed, the Shaykh rahimahullah, he shows the merits, the benefits of Tawheed. If you have Tawheed and you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, what does that give you? If the obligation was not enough for you to believe, that it brings you safety. That if you believe whatever your sins may be, you will enter Jannah in the end. You will enter the paradise in the end. And after that, he goes on and he speaks about how to actually achieve Tawheed. And he uses Ibrahim alayhi salam, who is one of the greatest role models of Tawheed. He uses him as an example and how to follow him. And then he moves on to shirk, the fear of shirk. If it was not enough that you understood the benefits of Tawheed and the obligation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put upon you, he shows you the fear that if you commit shirk, if you go against Tawheed, then your destination is the hellfire. Whatever you may do of good deeds and whatever it may be, that if you associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you die as a mushrik, your destination is the hellfire. And then he goes on to explain what La ilaha illallah actually is. That there is none worthy of worship except Allah. How to fulfill it. And that a person, once he has understood all of this and he's believed in Tawheed, that he must pass it on to the people. Spread it. Start with his family. Start with his friends. Go on to the people. Spread it. And this has been the call of all the prophets. And that's why they have been came down. Ibrahim alayhi salam, Musa alayhi salam, Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, all of the prophets, they came with this one same message, the message of Tawheed. Then the Shaykh rahimahullah, he went on to explain and show us certain types of shirk, such as amulets and hanging things and slaughtering for the sake of other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And today, or in this chapter, he goes on and he says, Babun min ash-shirki an-nadru li ghayrillah. The chapter that from shirk, from associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is making a vow to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he begins by saying, وَقَوْلِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ, that they fulfill the vows, speaking about those who are righteous. And then he also uses another ayah and he says, وَقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى, and he's saying, subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَا أَنفَقْتُمْ مِن نَفَقَةٍ أَوْ نَذَرْتُمْ مِن نَذْرٍ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ. That whatever you give in charity, or whatever you vow, or the vows that you make, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows it. And in these ayahs, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he praises those who have made a vow. Who have made a vow to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do a certain thing. A certain act of worship. That they are going to do this thing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises them. Because they do it to get closer to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that this, making this vow, is an act of worship in itself. and that is put together with charity. Charity, as we know, is an act of worship when you give sadaqah. And the vow is like that as well. It is an act of worship to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But how this links to the book of Tawheed, how does it link to it? Is that because it is an act of worship, it should only be done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Only be done in His sake. That a vow should not be made in other than the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore it makes it a part of Tawheed. Because of Tawheed, Al-Uluhiyyah, as we have explained, is worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So if this vow is an act of worship, then it must be only done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what we gain from these two ayahs, as we have said, is that it is an act of worship and it's only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we also know and see from this that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows everything. When you give sadaqah, when you make a vow, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He knows it. Many claim, or some claim, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can only know the thing when it happens. Wal-'iyad billah. Like, this shows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-knowing, whether it is happening now, in the future, or in the past. And it also shows that a person, and from those that are righteous, are those who fulfill their vows. So it is upon a person, if he makes a vow to do something, he must fulfill it. And then the Shaykh rahimahullah, he moves on. And he uses a hadith and he says, وَفِي الصَّحِيحِ عَنْ عَائِشَةَ رضي الله عنها أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من نذر أن يطيع الله فليطعه ومن نذر أن يعصي الله فلا يعصي. Whoever that in the Sahih report narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, whoever makes a vow to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then let him obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whoever makes a vow to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then let him not disobey. And this shows that a vow can either be done for good, or as a good deed, or as a sin. Because if you vow to do a sin, and obviously this is a sin, but if you vow to do a good thing and you fulfill it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praises you, as we have seen in the past ayahs. And this implies that it is an act of worship, and that it should only be done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what we gain from this is that a vow is a form of worship and is only done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that if you vow to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you say, I'm going to do this act of worship to get close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you must fulfill it. You have made this vow and you must come and fulfill it. But if you make a vow to do a sin or to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying, I will do this, and this goes against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is haram, it is prohibited for you to fulfill it. And then the Shaykh rahimahullah, he goes on to the next chapter and he says, and this is another type of shirk, he says, باب من الشرك الاستعاذة بغير الله. The chapter that from shirk is seeking refuge or seeking safety in other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Shaykh rahimahullah used the ayah وقوله تعالى وأنه كان رجال من الإنس يعوذون برجال من الجن فزادوهم رهقا. That there were men who used to seek, or there were men from mankind who used to seek refuge in the men of the jinn. And this only increased them in fear. And subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there are certain people, or there were certain people, men in the past, that they used to go and seek safety in the jinn rather than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They used to go seek safety from the jinn. And when you seek safety from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is shirk. Why? Because you are putting them on the same pedestal or the same level as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we know it is only so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we go to seek refuge from. A'udhu billah. We seek refuge from Allah. Min ash-shaytan ar-rajim, from the cursed shaytan. So seeking refuge from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting them on the same level as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is associating partners with Him. And what we gain from this is that seeking refuge and seeking safety is only in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you do seek refuge in other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rather than you actually getting the safety, it goes against it. You are only increased in fear and weakness. We know that subhanAllah, a lot of people, they go to the jinn and other things to get this dunya. But subhanAllah, if you seek refuge in them, and you give a characteristic of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to them, it only backfires in your face and it increases you in your fear. But if you seek refuge and you seek safety in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will give you strength. It will give you strength and it will give you safety. And then the Shaykh rahimahullah, he says, وعن خولة بنت حكيم قالت سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من نزل منزلا فقال أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات من شر ما خلق لم يضره شيء حتى يرحل من منزله ذلك. That is narrated on the authority of Khawala, the daughter of Hakim, that she said she heard the Prophet ﷺ say, whoever enters a passive place or whoever enters a certain land and he says, I seek refuge in the perfect words or the perfect word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the evil of what He has created, then nothing will harm him until he has left this place. And subhanAllah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he teaches this powerful dua for us to use and implement in our lives. And he shows us that if you are wanting to seek refuge and you're wanting to seek safety, and you want this to benefit yourself or you want this to benefit you, then it must be done and it must be sought in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not in anybody else. And he has given us, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this dua as a replacement from what the mushrikeen do when they seek refuge in other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we see, especially in this country, if someone gets scared or they're shocked, many people, what do they say? Even from the Muslims, they shout and they exclaim, Jesus Christ. And this is seeking help from Jesus, from Isa alayhi salam. But subhanAllah, it has become something so normal in our society, especially here. Kids, whenever they get scared, shouting it. SubhanAllah, this is even spread to some of the Arab countries due to social media and the like. Something so simple that they say when they are shocked or they are scared, like it is shirk, is associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you are seeking help from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And seeking refuge is a type of dua. And as we'll get onto that, making dua to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is shirk. Because you are seeking something from someone else and giving them the same level as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what we gain from this is that seeking safety and seeking refuge, because it is a type of dua, it's a type of worship. And as we have said before, that worship is only in the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it also shows us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks. His kalimat, His speech, His words. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks. لكن ليس كمثله شيء. That there is nothing like Him. So rather than certain people imagining that He speaks like us, or He speaks like this, or He speaks like that, ليس كمثله شيء. There's nothing else. There's nothing like Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us He speaks. But not in the matter that we think. Only what befits His majesty. And that His speech is not created. Because you're seeking refuge in His speech. So one might say you're seeking refuge in His speech, not Him. But His speech is not created. It's a part of Him. So this allows you to seek refuge in it. And subhanAllah, this one dua, it removes and it takes away many of the doubts that some people with the wrong aqidah they have. This one dua, subhanAllah. One that is not even meant to be stopping shit or going against their aqidah, it goes against their aqidah. And you see, this is the confusion. Like in the people who follow the Quran and the Sunnah, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, it's clear. It's in front of you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you this, you believe in. And we've also been told the benefit of this dua. How beneficial this dua is, and this is a merit of it. This is a benefit of it being attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that finally we know from this hadith that whatever happens to a person is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether you want good, whether you want bad, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for you, it will happen. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants evil for you, it will happen. So a person, he goes and he calls to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he does not call to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because his affairs, his matters are in His hand, Azza wa Jal. And bi'idhnillah, we will end with that. And in the next lesson, we will go through Bab min ash-shirki an yustaghitha bi ghayri Allah aw yad'u ghayra. The chapter that from shirk is going through or seeking help from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or making dua to them. هذا وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.